You have done your duty. Thank you very much. You've been through things tomorrow. I've got Andrew. Who I think is one of you? He might be, but I know. Right, Jackie, the floor is yours. Yeah, feel free. Feel free. I'm going to be on this side because tech support needs to be on this side. Good luck. Bye. Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. This session, I'm excited about, chairing this session on how we should be thinking about the challenges and opportunities for journalism in the Pacific right now. And I'm as much excited for the discussion because of the subject matter, but also, of course, because of who we have on the panel today. And that's partly because, I think that rather than looking back and sort of thinking about what are we missing, it's very much the conversation will be about what kind of things do we need to be thinking about to do, real journalism of value for our communities, looking forward. And, some of the important questions are, how do we remake journalism for the future? What does a journalism that meets the moment actually look like? And what do our communities really value? So to help us through this panel session, we have Dr. Kalinga Senaravatne from the University of South Pacific, who's talking about a needed new paradigm of community-centred watchdog journalism. Associate Professor Shailendra Singh, also from the University of South Pacific, who will be explaining their innovative model of student-led journalism in the Melanesian states. And Professor David Roby, who I've known for many years, going back to my time working with the International Federation of Journalists, from the Pacific Media Centre of the Asia Pacific Media Network. And he'll be talking about how investigative and storytelling models like Talanoa journalism can open our eyes to the blind spots of legacy news media. So I'll start by inviting Kalinga to present. Yeah, it should be found. It doesn't look bad. So take the photo, compulsory photo.
Okay, you can start.
Okay, thank you for the introduction. And also, I'm quite happy to speak at UTS, my alumni, where I did my postgraduate diploma in journalism, where I learned journalism here. It was the next building in those days. And also, I was involved with 2SR FM for 1.5 decades before I moved to Singapore. So let me start by looking at, for well over 5 decades, we have been teaching the watchdog theory of journalism as a hallmark of a free media. Today, this watchdog, unfortunately, has become the lapdog for everyone with power, and they are not necessarily governments. So, how do you change it?
Try the arrow. Try this arrow. Okay, so we'll have to do it here. So there's a little icon there.
So, watchdog journalism worked as long as media owners only own media. But today, they have become conglomerates, owning not only networks of media, but also other business, even in oil and arms industry. So when conglomerates own the media, we need a watchdog to watchdog the watchdog. So speaking at a media conference in Beijing in 2005, organized by EMIC, Dr. Sashi Tharoor, the then head of public information of the UN, and he was running for the Secretary General's post at the time. And he said, the question isn't whether the media teaches, it's what it teaches. It can reinforce existing stereotypes or build new positive ones. It can denigrate and dismiss cultures that are different, or it can show how wonderful this complicated world of ours is. The custodians of our airwaves can choose to be purveyors of weapons of mass destruction, or they can choose to be builders of a better world. Unfortunately, the Anglo-American media, which still wields enormous power to influence, or should I say to brainwash the world, has chosen to be weapons of mass destruction. If I'm going to list them, it will take me the rest of the day. Today, most of the world feels that the world peace is threatened not by Islamic terrorists, Russia or China, but by the US, NATO, and its allies like Australia. When I refer to most, I don't mean the international community the Western media talks about, but the global South, which is the larger international community. Today, most of the world, so unfortunately, the West has weaponized democracy and human rights. And the Anglo-American media is its missionaries. So-called color revolutions have manipulated the youth in the global South to overthrow governments which are not subservient to the West by calling for greater democracy and human rights. When they succeed, the new democracy has been more draconian than what they had. You may look at Egypt, Libya, Ukraine. These are some examples. And you may even add Sri Lanka. So it is no surprise that China's President Xi Jinping warned about these color revolutions in a speech to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in 2002. And he offered to set up what he called a counter-terrorism training center to help monitor them. Now, I would call this dollar-chasing democracy vendors. They say what Western funders want to hear. They cannot be trusted to be news sources. Most Asian governments, including India, have imposed strict controls on NGOs receiving money from overseas, because these color revolutions are fueled by Western funding agencies. If the media is going to act according to the true spirit of the watchdog media, they should be questioning loud and clear the military mindset of the West, where everything is today interpreted as security threats. And solutions are promoted as increasing your military budgets and preparing for war. War is good business for Americans. If you look at the stock market prices, you would notice that. In the US, I mean. Protecting democracy and human rights are pretexts for such warmongering. And the watchdog journalism, and the watchdog journalism have become their cheerleaders. While Australians come to the Pacific and also go to some parts of Asia to teach watchdog journalism and how to get their governments to account, they are not practicing at home. I don't see the Australian mainstream media taking the Australian government to task for committing to spend some 300 billion on the AUKUS nuclear submarine project when the public health system here is crying for increased funding with the treasured Medicare system under threat, and a serious skills shortage in Australia needing targeted funding to reskill Australia. I am yet to see serious debate in the Australian media about who is the enemy against whom Australia is arming itself to the teeth. If it is China, that country is also Australia's largest trading partner. And going to war with China is basically committing suicide. I suppose that's logical thinking. What COVID-19 pandemic exposed were the shortcomings in public health services and funding right across the world, and in the US and Europe in particular. The media in the West should have questioned public health funding rather than going on a China-bashing campaign. When the vaccines came, media should have questioned the big pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer for refusing to waive their patent rights while making insane profits out of the pandemic. That is watchdog journalism. Anybody trying to question this was called a conspiracy theorist and censored out of the media. Today, we often hear Western leaders and their media, Australia included, talking about protecting a rules-based order, from Chinese trends. Do these media ever ask, what is this rules-based order and how does it work? India's foreign minister Jaishankar, addressing the UN General Assembly in September this year, I think described this very well when he said, at a time when East-West polarization is so sharp and North-South divide is so deep, the New Delhi, that is the G20 summit, also affirmed that diplomacy and dialogue are the only effective solutions. The international order is diverse and we must cater for divergences, if not differences. The days when a few nations set the agenda and expect others to fall in line are over. As the United Nations itself symbolizes, finding common ground is an imperative. To listen to others and to respect their viewpoints, this is not weakness. It is the basics of cooperation. Only then can collective efforts on global issues be successful. He was directing this not at China. And China's foreign minister would have said the same if called upon to describe this so-called rules-based order. Most countries in the global south have been extremely unhappy at the way the West started a war with Russia and asked them to fall in line. Jaishankar has been very blunt about this, and videos of his interviews and comments have gone viral across the world. Today, when it comes to reporting China, not only the American media, but also the Australian media practice a type of journalism I see as China-bashing journalism, not watchdog journalism. Chinese call it smear journalism. Such journalism misrepresents many of the good things China is doing by calling these death traps or security threats. When it comes to reporting about China, Australian media has forgotten what objectivity and fairness is. This is irrational, irresponsible journalism, not freedom of expression. It is threatening Australia's security and that of the region. This type of China-bashing journalism is very common when the Australian media reports about China's engagement with the South Pacific. Everything they do is a security issue or threatening the rules-based order in the Pacific. Daru in Papua New Guinea is an interesting example. In December 2020, China announced a $200 million deal to build a fisheries harbor in this sleepy village, which didn't even have a daily market. Immediately, the Australian media and even some parliamentarians in Canberra went hysterical. I was in Australia at the time, shouting out that China is planning a naval base 200 kilometers from Australia's shores. What went unreported was that just before the announcement, China has built a fish processing plant in PNG and signed an agreement to allow PNG to export fish products to China, which has the world's biggest seafood market. In the long term, this project would have opened up the China market to the fishing industry right across the Pacific, while Daru Fishing Harbor, where a brand new city was to be built. A potential win-win situation was turned into a divisive security issue. China's engagement with the Pacific is growing. I had a 2-hour meeting with China's ambassador to Fiji recently, a couple of months ago. He told me that he would like the Pacific media to see China as a development partner. China has recently posted an agriculture technician to Fiji to train Fijian farmers in technology-based, high-yielding rice farming. In April 2022, China Pacific Island Countries Climatic Action Cooperation Center was inaugurated in Shandong province in China at one of the universities there. There are a number of other projects covering health, agriculture, construction, police training, etc. across the Pacific. Unfortunately, the Australian media is unable to see the development assistance aspects of these projects. On the other hand, they praise the Pacific Australia Labour Mobility Scheme, known as PALM, as a development aid project that will help Pacific Islanders, especially Fijians, to earn a good living in Australia and help their families back home to remittances. In a recent article in the Fiji Times, Catholic Archbishop of Fiji, Peter Loy Chong, claim that the workers are treated as modern-day slaves in Australia. It is not only seasonal workers. Australia is openly encouraging professionally qualified nurses, teachers, and other skilled staff to migrate to Australia to plug a skills shortage here. In the process, it is threatening to seriously disrupt public health and education sectors and the agriculture sector in Fiji. I think the Pacific media need to hold Australia accountable for this situation. But they are being guided by the Australians to think of the monetary benefits Fijian families will enjoy from remittances which are sent back home. Addressing an economic forum at the Asian Development Bank in Manila in September, Fiji's Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, Professor Biman Prasad, said, "We see major global powers locked in a geostrategic competition. This is hugely unsettling for us across the Pacific. Fiji and the Pacific nations find themselves on the front lines of this geopolitical contestation. This contestation will have long-term adverse consequences for the region. There are no win-win options on the road ahead, none. There will only be hard choices." The Australian and Western media have played a very irresponsible role in bringing the region to this predicament. They have created a poisonous cocktail of conflict reporting. And this kind of watchdog reporting, bias and prejudice, has created an adversarial journalism culture that is creating conflicts, and the media don't know how to solve it. In an essay by final year journalism student at USP, he said, "Development journalism is a news reporting framework that prioritizes economic and social development of a region. In the Pacific region, where many countries are still struggling with poverty and the lack of basic infrastructure, development journalism can play an important role in highlighting the issues and proposing solutions. This approach involves working closely with communities and stakeholders to identify their needs and to report on the progress being made towards achieving these goals. It can also help to foster a sense of community engagement and responsibility, which is crucial for long-term sustainable development." This is precisely what the Pacific media needs. Watchdog journalism concepts could be applied here to such reporting without treating these as conflicts, needing two opposing viewpoints. In the Pacific, we can address the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, and report in such a way that journalism assists in achieving these goals. Encouraging protests, riots, and chaos in the name of freedom of expression only disrupts such progress. In October this year, the United Nations Human Rights Council voted to forward to the UN General Assembly a draft international covenant on the right to development, which was supported by both China and India, but opposed by 13 Western countries. If adopted as an international treaty, which is a long way off, rather than individual rights, this community rights concept would be more suitable for the Pacific. Human rights, according to the Development Rights Agenda, are what is there in the SDGs: providing clean water and sanitation to the people, a good education, developing and nurturing sustainable systems of agriculture to provide food security to the people, protecting the environment and protecting communities from the impacts of climatic change, empowering women, providing proper housing and healthcare to people, and so forth and so on. Governments should be held accountable to providing these rights to people. But that cannot be achieved by the media always accusing governments of inefficiency or corruption. We as reporters need to go out to the communities, talk to the people, find out how they live, what is lacking, and how they think these services could be provided, and how by governments. Then we can ask questions from the government of how they could provide for the people and what are the barriers. Journalists could even become a facilitator of a dialogue between the communities and the government, rather than just attacking governments. Such development rights-based reporting could also question the geopolitical machinations in the region and question outside powers about their role in the Pacific affairs. Those trying to instigate color revolutions need to be exposed for trying to destabilize countries, and they should be made to account for it. In 2017 and 2018, I was involved with a group of Asian communication scholars with UNESCO funding based at Chulalongkorn University in Bangkok to develop curriculum to train Asian journalists in mindful reporting using philosophical concepts from Buddhism and Confucianism. We are now in the process of promoting this curriculum called Mindful Communication for Sustainable Development. This will be very useful for the Pacific to address climatic change issues. So let us rethink the concept of watchdog journalism, not reject it, but refine it so that journalism will unite and empower the people, not divide them. Actually, tomorrow I'm flying out to China to present a paper at an intercultural communication conference at a leading university in China. And we are also looking at developing a news network in the Asia-Pacific region to report with the development rights concept, using the development rights concept and the curriculum we have been developing in Asia. So let's hope we can use journalism to help in the peaceful development of societies, not to disrupt the peace in the name of freedom of speech. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kalenga. So next up, we have Associate Professor Shailendra Singh. Come and join us. Nurturing Resilient Journalists, a case study of student youth reporting in challenging Pacific Island environments. I have to share first. The arrows are just here.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Senevaratne ended his presentation on a perfect note for my presentation when he said that, let us rethink and not reject watchdog journalism totally. So I'll be also critiquing watchdog journalism in the beginning of my presentation, at least in the Fiji context, as well as in terms of teaching and practicing journalism at USP. So watchdog journalism, there have been question marks about watchdog journalism in Fiji for a long, long time, right? This is even prior to independence in 1970. And this is because the way in the Fiji Times portrayed some issues, especially ethnic issues, and also how they reported on ethnic Indians who were in Fiji at the time. And there were some major questions raised in Parliament about the nature of the reporting and how it was causing communal discord in Fiji and sort of worsening already fragile ethnic relations. So this is a long-standing question. It's an old question, of course, but the question is still around because it remains an unresolved question, not just in Fiji, but many other countries. So as you might know, if you know the history of Fiji, it's a multi-ethnic country plagued by ethno-political tensions, climaxing with 4 coups, and really damaging coups economically and socially, devastating coups, in fact. There's been no wide-scale violence so far. Thankfully, no wide-scale violence so far, but it cannot be ruled out in future. So this is the crux of it. No wide-scale violence, but cannot be ruled out in future, and neither can a 5th coup be ruled out in Fiji, right? So the situation in Fiji on the surface remains calm, but there are simmering tensions beneath the surface. So some of the questions that we wrestle with, that we agonize over, at USP journalism as part of the teaching and learning, and we get some really valuable feedback from the students, is: do media fuel communal tensions and contribute to instability in Fiji? And are the news media too negative? right? I'm not sure whether the mainstream media has the time, given their daily busy schedule, to consider these questions, but we certainly do in our teaching and learning at USP. And these questions gained momentum after the 2000 coup. The person in the photograph is the notorious George Spade, the face of the 2000 coup. And that was a really, really damaging coup for Fiji. And, the country barely escaped some major problem. So as I was saying, now there were major questions about the media coverage, the questions I just posed, the reason being, the way the media covered the 2000 coup, the new government that came into power was observed, and the Citizens Constitutional Forum, this is an NGO based in Suva, Fiji, and their opinion was media coverage played a significant role in propagating racial stereotypes and inciting racial feelings. Right? So very serious charges against the mainstream media by a major NGO in Fiji. Okay, now, hang on, I think I got it, hang on. Oh no.
You have to use the...
I've got it.
You got it?
Right now. And this is an observation by Michael Field. Now, Michael Field is a New Zealand-based journalist who's been covering the Pacific region for decades. And he's a journalist, I would say, with a Western mindset. And he said the Fiji media, or at least sections of the Fiji news media, were reluctant to accept Mahendra Chaudhry's victory, and that the media were arrogantly anti-democratic. Now, this is a really astounding allegation to make against a news media by a Western journalist, right? You might see this from a developing country journalist who believes in development journalism and all that. But this is a Western country journalist with a Western mindset accusing the news media in Fiji, practicing watchdog journalism, of being anti-democratic. So you might say these are just opinions. What about, has there been any research to substantiate such claims? Professor Roby did a research paper after the 2000 coup, and he interviewed several people for that paper. And I think one of the best interviews and explanations came through Professor Stephen Ratuva. He's a political scientist based at the Macmillan Brown Center in New Zealand. And I think Professor Ratuva really captured it really nicely, the nuances and the complexities of the situation in Fiji, when he said that the media did not create the conditions for ethno-nationalist upsurge, which was already present, but the media did provide the nationalists the legitimacy to roll on with their plans. Some very quick background, Mahendra Chaudhry, against whom the coup was executed in the year 2000, was Fiji's first Indo-Fijian prime minister, and some ethnic Fijians, the nationalistic-minded ones, disapproved of an Indo-Fijian prime minister for Fiji. The military is mostly indigenous Fijians, and some of them staged a coup. So that is the context or the background. Now, you might say that, this is a qualitative research based on interviews. Were there any quantitative research done or not? And yes, there was a quantitative research done as well, a content analysis of the Fiji Times, at the time owned by Rupert Murdoch's News Limited. This was by Obini, published in 2000, and he was a master's student. And his research found, this is what he concluded after his content analysis. This is the conclusion he reached, and he said there's a clear difference between informing the public in unbiased manner and waging a war of destabilization. So what he's doing here is actually accusing Fiji's #1 newspaper, Fiji's national newspaper, of engaging in a war of destabilization, very serious allegation. And he goes on to say the Times waged relentless campaign against the fledgling government. Relentless campaign, very strong words. And he also said, without giving the coalition the time to settle down, this is a new government, it was given no time to settle down. The Fiji Times started hammering it. Right, and then he goes on to add that sensitive issues were blown out of proportion and given more attention than they deserved. And this was amplified in the front pages and editorials, right? So very serious allegations against the Fiji Times. This is based on a quantitative analysis, and this is not the only quantitative analysis to reach similar conclusions. There was another one done by Thakur Ranjit Singh under the supervision of Professor Roby, and his conclusions were very similar to this. right? So if you ask the editors of course, the editors will say we have done no wrong. We simply report the facts as we see it. But, you know, facts, subjective, so let's just say that. Now, I covered the 2000 coup as a journalist, and I interviewed Mr. Krishna Dutt. He was the education minister in the ousted coalition government, as well as a very prominent union leader. And this is what he had to say. He said, journalists abroad have a certain style questioning issues, and they adopt a particular slant, which is fine in fully fledged democracies that can take it. But here we had a fledgling democracy. This is the thing, Fiji is a fledgling democracy, right? People tend to forget this, especially those who are clamoring for media freedom. Of course, media freedom is important, but media freedom is tied to the national context as well. And then he was saying we had a fledgling democracy which hadn't got its roots dug in. And that kind of aggressive, relentless criticism of the government did a lot of damage. Now, one of the things the Fiji Times was doing was criticizing and accusing the Prime Minister of being too dictatorial and arrogant, right? This was the accusation. And I posed the question to Mr. Dutt, and he said we could score all these and see where the problem lies. Whether it was a reaction to media image about government, or was it the reality? So did the media paint this image about the government, or was it the reality? And he said, unless we delve deeply into these issues, it's not fair to jump to conclusions. Okay, so I did this interview in the year 2000 as a journalist. Now, the interesting thing about this is this. At the time, the Fiji Times was owned by the Murdoch Media News Limited, and we had 2 Australian editors that were overseeing the Fiji Times operation, right? So News Limited, Australian editors, and I spoke to the local editor of the Fiji Times for my PhD thesis, and he said the instructions from these editors was no holds barred journalism, right? The truth at any cost. So what they were trying to do was to transplant the style of journalism practiced in Australia into Fiji. Now, this might be a bit of a crude comparison, but still, it's worth considering maybe. It's a bit like the Americans trying to force democracy on Iraq. Okay, maybe it's a bit of an exaggeration, but still. So this is just the Fiji context. Now, this is why I call this is the coup effect. Now, this is why context is so important to journalism in Fiji. The context, journalism in Fiji must be tied to the context. Right now, the coup effect, we've had 4 coups that are linked to serious and sustained decline, permeating all levels of society, right? Fiji has been performing well below its potential. At one time, Fiji was touted as the Singapore of the Pacific, and I would say the 4 coups put paid to that. Now, we've got a 20-year infrastructure deficit of $3.4 billion, right? Due to persistent instability. This is something a small developing country like Fiji can ill afford. And by 2011, Fiji had lost 1,700 million due to the 2006 coup. And this data was generated by 2 very prominent Fiji economists, Professor Wadanarsi and Professor Biman Prasad, who is now the Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister of Fiji. So the 400 million loss in government revenue would have gone to, and we can see the 400 million loss in government revenue up to this day in terms of the lack of services and education, health, public debt. We've got a huge public debt and infrastructure, right? So all this money could have been put to really good use for the benefit and welfare of the citizens of the country. So, and then Fiji's precarious position has progressively worsened over the past 25 years, and even to this day, right, a 5th coup cannot be ruled out. So this is why, the national context must be tied to the education and practice of journalism. And if when I say Fiji's position is progressively worsened, if you look at, for example, the longevity, right? Our people are dying very young, and we've got serious problems with lifestyle diseases, no crime, for example, lack of opportunities and prospects for young people. This is not being blamed on the media, of course. This is being blamed on the coup. And some people allege that the media, of course, had a hand in the execution of the coup, at least the 2004. Now, this is the crux of it, one of the situation. Because of the way the media covered the 2000 coup, the Bainimarama government, which came to power in Fiji's fourth coup in 2006, introduced the Media Industry Development Act in 2010 in the name of, social cohesion and political stability, which are tied to development. So they are using the media coverage of the 2000 coup as a justification for imposing stricter controls in the news media in Fiji. And look at some of the rationalizations they use to justify the act, right? They're saying the national stability, socioeconomic rights are just as important as civil political rights. So, you wonder if there's a hierarchy of rights, right? Which rights come first and which rights come second or third. Maybe they're all tied together, I don't know, but this is the argument they used. They also stated that we recognize freedom of expression, yes, but not the freedom to incite violence or racial hatred. Right? And they said free speech. This is what the Prime Minister Bainimarama said. He said free speech causes trouble, and we need journalism of hope to portray positive contributions as well. And finally, he said freedom of expression is not an absolute right. With freedom comes the responsibility to keep our society cohesive, as well as protect the rights of every citizen. Now, to the people of Fiji, these must have sounded like very compelling arguments, because when the Media Industry Development Act was introduced in 2010, it was a major event in Fiji's history and in the history of Fiji's media, because for the first time, the news media would come under government control. Right? All this time, the news media was free of government control or self-regulated. For the first time in history, media is now under government control, but there was hardly any public protest, right? So you wonder why. Was the government's message getting through to the masses, right? Were they sympathizing with the government, with what the government was saying? Or maybe they were being apathetic. We don't know what the real cause is, but it would seem that maybe there was some sympathy with what the government was saying, because the people have lived through 4 coups. And part of the blame was, the media was being blamed, partly at least. Okay. So the problem is, right, what happened was the act has been in place now, or had been in place for at least 12 years before it was repealed by the new government just this year, early this year. So in the 12 years, the Media Act in Fiji became associated with self-censorship in the news media sector. Right? So self-censorship, of course, anyone who has read about self-censorship will know how insidious it is. And just before the act was repealed, the Reporters Without Borders assessment of the media situation in countries, they dubbed Fiji as the worst place in the Pacific to be a journalist. Right? So development journalism and all this is okay, but it is a risky prospect. It can become the slippery slope to greater government control of the news media. So this is the context in Fiji, and I believe context is tied to resilient journalism and resilient journalists. So, we discuss these issues a lot in the classroom. And okay, now very quickly, the Pacific news media terrain, this is where our students operate in. So David Roby wrote in 2006, it takes raw courage to be a neophyte journalist in the Pacific region. And this is because, besides journalism, Pacific media students need to be taught how to avoid fiscal threats and bribery, right? This is our context. This is what happens, not just in Fiji, but other Pacific Island countries as well. Now, Roby was speaking during a very turbulent period. The region was still reeling from the Bougainville Civil War, the Fiji coups, and the ethnic crisis in the Solomon Islands, as well as political assassinations in New Caledonia and Samoa. Fast forward to today, the situation has hardly changed. If you look at the photograph on the left, that's the Indonesian delegation at the Melanesian spearhead group meeting just this year. And they were accused of attempting to bribe a Fiji-born radio New Zealand journalist, right? So he reported the matter. So you can see bribery remains a problem. And I would say bribery of journalism is one of the hidden problems in Pacific journalism. It has never really been researched. And if you look at how poorly Pacific journalists are paid and all the geopolitical interests in the Pacific region by countries like Indonesia, China, and so forth, bribery of journalists, young journalists, is a real risk. So it still seems to be the problem. And then the photograph on the right is on the streets of unrest on the streets of Honiara in 2021. And the journalists who were covering this event came under harassment, intimidation, and almost got assaulted. So the Pacific news reporting theater is still quite risky for our journalists. So I'm going to now just, so in preparation for this presentation, I went back to the 2000 coup coverage, which was supervised by Professor Roby. And of course, besides the usual, lessons of honing your writing skills and all that, I think one of the major lessons that might have been overlooked was, this dose of reality that journalism students experience that shattered maybe the idealistic views of journalism, academic freedom, and freedom of speech. And this is when the University of the South Pacific attempted to close the website and also stop the newspaper from being circulated. Of course, the USP may have had good reasons. They were worried about the safety risks to the staff and students because the newspaper was quite critical of the coup. But still, the students, they expected maybe the government to clamp down. That was okay. They expected that. But they never expected the USP to take that kind of action, right? Because the USP is seen as a bastion of free speech, as I was saying, and of course, academic freedom. And we did another paper, and we interviewed one of the students, Joe Yaya, and he said that, USP infringed on media freedom. We were providing a great service, informing the world of what was happening. So what we learned from this, at least what the students learned, was that journalism can be a thankless task, right? This is the grounding they get through practical reporting. I remember the vice chancellor at the time said, a journalist should do simulated journalism, right? But you can't learn all this by doing simulated journalism. And they learned a first-hand lesson, right? This is personal experience, the difference between theoretical concepts and the practical realities of doing journalism. Now, the other case study I'm going to very quickly go through. We also covered the 2006 coup. Now, the 2006 coup, post-2006 coup, the challenge we faced was punitive legislation. It wasn't there in the 2006 coup. The 2009 public emergency regulations and the media decree implemented in 2010. Now, while we are a student publication, but equally bound by the law, right? We are equally bound by the law, whether student, the law applies to us equally. However, we had some advantages as a student newspaper, and we utilized it to the full. We remained under the radar, and we were able to operate under fewer restrictions, less scrutiny, and less suppression because we are just a student publication, limited circulation, and infrequently published. So that is how we remain under the radar, but we still managed to contribute to the media discourse at a time when the national media was strained, right? Because we figured that we are students, we are a student publication, the government won't come down that hard on us. So we were willing to take some calculated risks and do some bold journalistic reporting. And one of the major events that happened in the 2006 coup was the deportation. They deported Evan Hanna, who was the publisher of the Fiji Times at the time. And his wife was an academic staff at USP, a local woman, pregnant at the time. And we interviewed her about the traumas she might be experiencing while pregnant. And her husband, the manner in which her husband was deported. And that we ran on the front page of our newspaper. And that was quite a critical report, but luckily no action was taken against us. The other story we covered in relation to the 2006 coup was a 4-page insight report on the coup's impact on the news media sector in Fiji. And the lead story was headline, quote, "In the crossfire, Fiji media and the coups," and we highlighted the media's great challenges as well as the responsibilities, right, in coup situations. So this was a very in-depth report on the media sector. And the news media in Fiji, the mainstream news media, would have never run an in-depth report of this matter because the news media don't cover themselves, right? So I think this newspaper, this is how the student newspapers can provide a real service especially when the situation is, when there are controls and draconianism in the country. How much time do I have? I'm almost done.
Sorry, a couple of minutes.
Okay, so this is it. This might be my last case study. This is the elections coverage. So, we cover the elections as well. And the beauty about covering elections is, again, apart from the, the usual writing skills, you learn a lot more while on the field covering elections. And this is the pre-election preparation that we undergo. It gives the students a real understanding about things like the electoral laws of the country, right? The media laws of the country, and various other things. And I don't think the mainstream news media receive that kind of training or grounding before an election because they are so busy, right? They might do 1 or 2 workshops, but we have several workshops to prepare our students. And these are the lessons they will remember for a long, long time. So this is another advantage of covering elections. And some of the resources we utilized was the national media reporting of the 28 general elections. We did a content analysis in which we found that the mainstream news media in Fiji, all except one, were heavily biased in favor of the government. And that was part of the workshop, right? So some lessons for the news media as to how this government was being favored by most of the media in Fiji at the time for various reasons. We also utilized a conflict-sensitive reporting manual in some of the workshops that we held for our students. The Media Act, we scrutinized the Media Act in detail. It was a really problematic Media Act because it was very unclear. And the provisions were quite general in nature. So there was a lot of uncertainty. And this was one of the major problematic provisions in the Media Act. I mean, you can see how unclear and general it is, right? So the journalists are bound to be, for example, content must not include material against the public interest or order. So who decides what is in the public interest or order, right? Is it the government? Is it the opposition? Is it the journalist or what? So these are some of the things we discussed. The other reason why the training was so important before the elections is because of our former supervisor of elections, a feisty fellow who's prone to insulting journalists, threatening them, and trying to intimidate them. And we knew that, if you set a foot wrong, he would not hesitate to penalize us. And all credit to the Fiji Elections Office. Of course, they also provided a lot of resources and material for training our students. So 2018 elections, very quickly, we had 10 student reporters plus 2 staff members. And we covered Suva as well as the western side. In total, we tried to cover 10 districts. And we had a budget of $3,400 over 5 days. And this money came from sales of the advertising sales in the student newspaper. And we did not want to put too much pressure on our students. So we told them at least 1 story a day, right? That's the minimum. Don't confine yourself to 1 story a day. If you want to do more, fine. But we were focusing on quality rather than quantity. And the reporting focus was we want to go and bring back faces and voices of ordinary voters. And the stories should reflect their hopes and aspirations and also highlight youth and gender. This is how we want to differentiate ourselves from the mainstream news media. We looked at David Roby's paper as well in preparation. And one of the things he highlighted was how the mainstream news media was focused on slanging matches between politicians. And that guided our election preparation and the focus of the elections. Okay, I'm nearing the end of my presentation. This is the coverage. If you see the front page, we gave to an ordinary voter. The winning prime minister was relegated to the 2nd page. And the leader of the largest opposition party, the man who executed the 1987 coup, he was relegated to the 3rd page. He's now the prime minister of Fiji. Of course, he won the last elections in Wansolwara. You will notice we gave quite a fair amount of prominence to female MPs because this election, 2018 election, we had the highest number of female MPs ever elected into the Fiji Parliament. Youth participation is, we also focus on youth, not just for the sake of focusing on youth, but because we have in the Pacific what is known as a youth bulge. In Fiji, this translates as being, they make up 1/3 of the total registered voters. right? But this is not reflected in the political class or in parliament, in the makeup of parliament, right? And one of the refrains we often hear is how our current leadership is out of touch because they are an aging leadership in their 60s, 70s, and 80s. I think the Prime Minister is 78 years old. And so the reason was to maybe, encourage the youths in our own small little way of taking interest in the political affairs of the country. And one of the people we covered was the youngest candidate in the 2018 elections. At 20 years old, he received only about 129 votes, I think, but he was undeterred. Interesting thing is he was a journalism student and he suspended studies to try his luck in the elections. And right now, he is the executive secretary of the Home Affairs Minister in Fiji. Okay, so I'm going to skip this. The 2022 elections, we covered it, but not as thoroughly because it was in December. All our students had gone home or abroad, or they were working already during the holidays. I'll jump to the conclusions. This is the kind of coverage we did, right? Ordinary voters and use your photographic skills and all that. And of course, we told them that doesn't mean you close your eyes to any newsworthy event that might happen, but this is the focus of our coverage. So this is what we learned, what we learned from our practical reporting. It takes a lot of work and time and effort, but it is worth it. USP journalism does not shy from tough assignments because otherwise we'll be doing our students a real disservice. Shielding students from the real world that awaits doesn't prepare them adequately for future challenges, and exposure to the elements provides an early taste of the real world. Challenges they are bound to face in their future roles. And with proper preparation, this is the key, and safety precautions. We pay a lot of emphasis on safety precautions. Coups and elections are an opportunity to apply ethics and safety guidelines for operating in a responsible and conscientious manner. Pre-elections training deepens student knowledge about national issues, electoral systems and all that, as does the experience of covering the elections. A lot of focus on covering the elections itself, but pre-election training, that's also important. Student media contribute an alternative view, and the student media is a strategic asset in a country like Fiji, where the national media landscape, especially under a climate of state censorship. So there's state censorship, we can operate under the radar, and we gamble that the government will not come down so hard on us, right? Because we are, after all, just a student publication. And finally, being put into difficult situations allowed our students to hone their problem-solving skills as well, right? Not just the writing skills, also problem-solving skills, and work out innovative ways of overcoming obstacles. Okay, thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Shailendra. Very interesting. And I think we'll jump straight into the next presentation, and that should still allow us some time to unpack some of this with questions. So next up, we have Professor David Rody on media morality, independence and telenovelas, an alternative Pacific journalism education model. Over to you, David. So, press that button. I'm sure I press that button. Now the arrows are very well hidden over here.
So I can just go. Thanks so much. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. This Indigenous te reo greeting from our tangata whenua, our Indigenous people in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And I want to acknowledge the Indigenous, we're on the Indigenous land here in UTS, Indigenous people of here as well. And first I'd like to just give a few words to provide a bit of context to my positionality around what I'm going to present here, which is rather a snapshot of what's actually in the paper itself. But I also want to acknowledge, I want to sort of express my solidarity for the journalists and the people of Gaza and Palestine, because I think there are a number of issues that are really coming up that are really quite important that really relates to the Pacific as well. And well,
to give you a bit of a sort of a snapshot on how I actually got into this direction, after a typical Kiwi journalism formation, the School of Hard Knocks with the Dominion daily newspaper in Wellington, the capital of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and periods as a sub-editor on the Melbourne Herald, and editor of the Sunday Observer, which was based in and that paper was known for its opposition to the Vietnam War, and Australia's involvement in that. I migrated to apartheid South Africa in 1970 to prepare for an overland trip across Africa and the Sahara Desert. And I was chief sub-editor of the Royal Daily Mail, which was the leading newspaper in South Africa at the time, which was opposed to apartheid, with many of its journalists banned and some who were also in jail. While I was there, I learned far more about journalism and justice there than what I'd learned in Australia and New Zealand for Aotearoa. Ironically, 3 years working for AFP news agency in Paris prepared me for global news values and also the South Pacific. I actually, my Pacific career sort of came through the back door from Paris. Anyway, I started reporting on New Zealand and Pacific issues, such as French nuclear testing from Paris. And both South Africa and Paris got me questioning a lot about the news values and structural hegemony. When I returned to Aotearoa, I was foreign editor of the Auckland Star, then set up my own independent news agency covering the South Pacific. One of the reasons for that was that I was very frustrated with the way the Auckland Star and other New Zealand media was covering the Pacific. So I thought, well, actually, I can contribute far more by being a freelancer and covering the region. So I reported for Islands Business magazine in Fiji, and later Pacific Islands Monthly, that was also originally was based in Sydney, but then also in Fiji until it closed, and other global news media. Then in 1994, I was appointed to the University of Papua New Guinea as head of journalism. And then I embarked on an issues and project-based journalism initiative. I guess one of the things that coming straight from journalism into a university, I was able to challenge quite a lot of things that were happening at the university and experiment, I guess, in a sense. Anyway, so already critical of some aspects of mainstream journalism, and especially how it covered the other and the Pacific, I began developing ideas and strategies around journalism could be loosely described as the Pacific way. These ideas were drawn largely from the students themselves and how they interacted with major issues and crises. They were significantly different from what I'd encountered with a lot of Western mainstream media, and more akin with what I experienced in Kenya as the features editor of the Aga Khan's Daily Nation, which was the independent newspaper that was committed to independence, and it opposed the establishment colonial media of the past, and also in South Africa. These ideas related especially to economic and cultural development and social justice. And the notion of Talanoa journalism was involved about this time, but it's gradually progressed from that. And I'm not going to cover much of that in this presentation now because I've written about this, and it's in the paper itself. But essentially, just encapsulate some of the key points around Talanoa journalism is more of an emphasis on grassroots sources. And I'd like to see your presentation there, Shalendra, with Wansolwara, the coverage of the 2018 elections, how the front page focused on just an ordinary person. And the politician was the ousted Prime Minister. Well, he was still Prime Minister at the time, but and then the opposition were on the secondary pages. And I think that's actually a reflection of the Talanoa approach. So grassroots sources privileged over the establishments. Anyway, hard news with context, yes, but cultural context and cultural explanations continually. Free media balanced with social responsibility, community ethics and Indigenous values, and also trying to seek solutions. So also another point is that by reporting truth to power also involves critically reporting our very own institutions, whether they are media organisations or universities. And of course, it can be very tricky and challenging. So I've sort of might just start off here with University of Papua New Guinea, because I think my background is I've been head of journalism at 2 universities in the Pacific, and then ran a Pacific program in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And it's quite interesting to sort of see the different trends and influences that it can have. So along with, at the University of Papua New Guinea, the program that began there, sorry, I've just got my paper, my notes that I've missed up here. But so for this presentation, I'm giving, we share a snapshot of the Talanoa development at these 3 institutions. So the story starts at the University of Papua New Guinea for me. And the journalism program there is the oldest in the Pacific. It was founded in 1975 as an independence, quote unquote, gift for Papua New Guinea by the New Zealand government. And so therefore it had quite a bit of involvement for funding and so on from New Zealand for a number of years. So it was established by television journalist Ross Stevens. You can see him in the screen there. Late Ross Stevens, I might add, and historian Michael King. They're both not with us anymore, but Michael King was interesting because he was a journalist, but then he was among the first Pākehā that actually covered Te Reo Māori issues and so on. And he coined this phrase, Ngāti Pākehā, for white New Zealanders, like myself, and who did not identify as European. And this is where the notion of Talanoa journalism was taking root, with a series of reports by the students themselves embedded in local villages who wrote about facing climate change way back then, and also survival for squatters. And there's massive squatter issues around Port Moresby, the capital of Papua New Guinea. And Uni Tābua was their student newspaper, started by Ross Stevens, carried on by me, and I established a link like a Schlender with the daily newspaper, the Post-Courier. So it actually became a lift out, the weekend edition. The whole paper came out, and so we had quite a big audience, thanks to the Post-Courier at the time. Yeah, I'm still in this. So yes, it was their paper, which played quite a significant role in journalism in PNG. So along with core journalism skills and media students in the South Pacific, especially PNG, we taught with the aid of the UNESCO's News Manual, which is a 3-volume journalism textbook, if you like, for journalists in the region. It's actually used in a lot of other countries around the world as well. It was funded by UNESCO, but it was actually developed out of the UPNG journalism program and used a lot of cartoons. It was quite innovative at the time. It's actually really aimed at Pacific journalists. And also we taught students how to respond to censorship, physical threats, and attempts of bribery, a major issue. It's not as well researched as it has been said. It's not, and probably not as serious a problem as some countries, neighbouring countries, Indonesia, for example, Philippines, but it is an issue. And also they were taught about how to defend media freedom from all kinds of repression. Media freedom is not just something abstract in the Pacific. The young student journalists live with it all the time, and with threats and other sort of pressures that they have to deal with. And we also dealt with the cultural and linguistic diversity, because Papua New Guinea has 832 living languages in PNG, not just dialects, they're actually living languages. And in the journalism program, I'm not sure what the situation is now, but at the time that I was teaching there, journalists had 3 languages to deal with in their courses. So English was the main language for media, but they also had Tokus and Motu, and they were examined and tested in their proficiency in all 3. Right, so I'll just give a couple of quick examples of this. So Kempian Hasio, the guy in the left of the image there, and this is cartoons on the right there. Kempian, he started his career as a student journalist on the B-Journ program at UPNG, and he was cartoonist from 1994 until 96 for Uni Tābua, and also he was a cartoonist for Pacific Journalism View, which actually began at UPNG. And so his initial, today, after a stellar career in political and social justice, and political cartoonist. He's now established artist in his own right and graphic designer in the Solomon Islands, and he's also the managing director of Indigenous media. Among big stories covered by the student journalist from Unitava was using Talanoa methodology in the 1997 Sandline mercenary crisis in Papua New Guinea. Now, this is a political scandal that became one of the defining moments in PNG history over the Bougainville War, where the Prime Minister at the time, his government, Sir Julius Chan, they recruited mercenaries. And Sandline was the name of the mercenary contract company and so on. But military commander at the time, Brigadier General Jerry Singarok, who's staged a revolt, not a coup, a revolt, but on the night of 16th of March 1997, when 44 mainly British and South African mercenaries were arrested at dawn and disarmed. Singarok realised that this could have enormous repercussions for the country and a bloodbath in Bougainville and so on. Thought this is the only thing that had to be done was get rid of these mercenaries. And of course, enormous cost and risk to himself and also the senior military commanders. I mean, it was the end of his military career. He had no interest in power as such, anything like that. It was basically to stop this preparations by the PNG government of the day to use mercenaries. I see he's published a book about his experiences just last year, I think it was, and there was also a film being made in the process. But anyway, Prime Minister Chan, Sir Julius Chan, was forced to resign of this, and there was enormous hullabaloo about it. But the journalism students are right in the middle of this, covering this. And people say to me, yeah, but why have students doing this? But many of the student journalists were not any younger than the journalists in the mainstream media. So they had a real role to play. And many of them actually were working journalists coming to UPNG to upskill their degrees and qualifications generally. Moving on to Fiji, the University of the South Pacific. So USP journalism began much, hang on, yep, that's right. USP journalism began much later than UPNG, and I was appointed head in 1998, after it had been earlier founded by French government assistance. And Wansolwara, as Shendra's talked quite a lot about the development of Wansolwara and what a tremendous job it does in Fiji. So that was the newspaper that was founded earlier on. At that time, and it's continued, of course, and at that time we had a website called Pacific Journalism Online. Now it was quite innovative because none of the daily newspapers in Fiji at that time had a website. And Pacific Journalism Online later closed, but it's Wansolwara News today online is followed on in its tremendous traditions. Anyway, so at the time, I founded this website before the local dailies had created their websites. And so Wansolwara, did you give the meaning of the name Wansolwara at all? No, basically that means literally it's one salt water. And really reflects on the common languages, the common culture around the Pacific. So my biggest challenge at USP was covering the George Speight coup that Shalendra has talked about in his presentation just now. And I'd say it's today, even today, I'm retired now, of course, but it was the biggest challenge I've had in journalism education anywhere really. So what happened, Shalendra mentioned all this, but in which George Speight, when he and his rebel soldiers from the Counter-Revolutionary Warfare Unit, which had been set up to protect the country from precisely a coup, seized Parliament and Prime Minister Mahendra Chaudhry and 35 other government MPs at gunpoint for 56 days. And this was only one of the coups that Shalendra was talking about. But anyway, Speight was jailed for life for high treason. And he sought a pardon earlier this year, didn't he, Shalendra? But he hasn't got anywhere with that. So just continuing on in this, among big stories, right. Oh, sorry. I've got back-to-back things and I'm getting crossed over here. Anyway, so the USP students vigorously covered the attempted coup on 19th May 2000, round the clock for both their newspaper and online editions, and Radio Pasifik as well, initially, for 2 months. Anyway, many of the students coped with the military curfew by living in the Wansolwara newsroom. And I should explain there's a context there because the university closed down the website, sent all the students home to different regions, but the journalism students carried on. There's no way I was going to stop them. They wanted to carry on covering the coup. So, I mean, is this a chance in their lifetime? But of course, it was a lot of questions around that. They might have a chance to discuss some of those issues a bit later on. But anyway, as head of journalism, I had to also daily brave the military blockades without being arrested, because I lived off campus. Although many of the students were living on campus, I actually lived off and had to get home without, although I had a permit at times, I didn't always get the permit renewed. And so technically I was illegally out and about, sort of thing. Anyway, the students won 5, some of you might, I think, Angela, you were there at the time, but 5, the students won 5 Aussie Awards, including Best Publication at the 2000 JERAA conference on the Sunshine Coast as a result. Now, in this picture here, I just want to show this, but the 2 people there, so we all know George Speight, well, many of us know George Speight as an image, but the guy on the right there is Joe Nata. Now, he's also jailed for treason. He was a journalist. He was probably the best investigative journalist in Fiji at the time. But he made the mistake of thinking that George Speight needed a good media minder, and so threw in his lot with them. And so in the end, he was jailed for treason as well. Anyway, so marching on, there were many remarkable stories filed by the students and also about the students reported by global news agencies. Among them was the incredible story of Noura Ali. She's the one in the middle, of course. And she was an exchange student from the Maldives. And all the students were reporting on the hostage crisis in pairs. That's a safety thing. We tried to sort of protect them in that way. And she, in this photo, she's pictured with her Samoan student buddy, who was covering the time. But Noura was kissed by George Speight in Parliament, where the government's been held at gunpoint. So she was completely bemused by this, and really it was sort of a real issue that the students really talked about, and how this coup leader took advantage of it. He thought she was Indo-Fijian, but she's from the Maldives. Anyway, her story became, she wrote about it. So that's the story there for Pacific Scoop in New Zealand. The day I was kissed by a coup leader, I wrote a beautiful story about it. It was picked up by Michael Field, who was then reporting for Agence France Presse in Fiji, and his story went around the world about the student who was kissed by the coup leader. Anyway, so later on, she became a leading official in the Maldives Information Ministry. And I must say that all the students who were involved in reporting this coup all had amazing jobs as a result. Not a result of the coup itself, but what they learnt in a very short space of time. Incredible experience, really, and very risky. Now, should I mention about this, that the USP shut down the journalism website and also tried to ban the newspaper and so on as well. And this became a celebrated cause around the world. What I've got there is a committee to protect journalists statement that was put out. Anyway, this was a very notorious incident. Because it was completely misguided, but it really frustrated the students. Here they were writing these incredible stories. They were updating the website every hour or so. Bearing in mind, there's no other website at the time. Michael Field called it the internet coup, and it was largely because of the students' efforts. But it also contributed to safety of academic staff, because they actually know what's going on, and everybody's very confusing times and very threatening times. The food supplied to the university was at a shop called Fatty's just across the road from the main entrance to the university. And so everything around university life, what students were actually still living there and that sort of thing, was affected by what was happening. And so it really needed to be reported, and this was. But the CPJ issued a statement, and Reporters Sans Frontières also issued a statement condemning the closing of the students' website, and I'll just quote from this CPJ one, because their statement was condemning violence against journalists in Fiji at the time, where at least 15 people were killed over a longer period connected to the coup. And also they protested about the closure of the USP journalism website. Quote, on 29th of May 2000, administrators at the University of South Pacific shut down Pacific Journalism Online, the website of USP's journalism students. Vice-Chancellor Ezekiel Salofa explained the decision as a security measure. In fact, by closing it down was creating considerable risk to the university community, and particularly staff as well as the students and so on. Anyway, so later on, the faculty had a unanimous, after this was all over, more or less, and the coup had ended and George Speight was facing trial and that sort of thing. The faculty at USP had the faculty that the journalism program was situated had a unanimous resolution to condemn the university for closing the site at that time. But I just wanted to next thing, just quickly. Just a couple of minutes, if you can give me, please. But yeah.
Questions, that's what I want to check. Yeah. So then at the moment we've got 15 minutes.
All right. So
you can wrap up.
I'll try to wrap up as possible. Yes. All right. Look, so the university. I just want to show you a little bit of a video from the students made at the time, just to give you sort of a context of it. Technically, we had very poor equipment at the time, but it'll just give you sort of an idea. This was telling their story, and it is actually on YouTube. So if anybody wants to have a look at the whole thing, but we've got some sound.
I can hear sound. Yeah.
This was the bush track that they went from the university into Parliament. Now, I didn't know that they were doing that initially. I was sending them on taxis to cover the coup, and then they're sneaking because none of the taxi drivers would send them anyway. I'll just give you just a bit of an idea. Okay, so right. So the coverage of the coup by the students and their dilemmas and how they applied Talanoa journalism was analysed in my book, Meckham News, published in 2024 at the time. So, okay, now I'm going to move on to, just quickly, on to AUT and the Pacific Media Centre. So the PMC was founded in 2007 with this mission: informed journalism and media research contributes to economic, political and social development. And AUT's PMC, Te Omakura, which is the indigenous name for the entity, seeks to stimulate research into contemporary Māori, Pacific and ethnic diversity, media and cultural production. And many of the projects that were launched, because we had a big emphasis on projects and students actually concentrating and focusing on projects. And many of them are using Talanoa methodology. Right, so oh, yes. So a feature of the PMC was creating teaching tools by the students themselves as part of their coursework. An example of such a tool is this clip of the late based British journalist, Robert Fisk. Some of you probably met Robert Fisk over his incredible career, where he was commenting on 50-50 journalism. And I think I really need to show you that, because I think this was just an example of many clips that were made by the students, but I think this got quite a lot of resonance right now.
Well, in Britain, we don't like journalists at school, but in America, what they teach you is, apart from another load of cliches, is give half your story to one side and half to another in a dispute. That's okay if you're doing a football match, if you're covering a public inquiry into a new highway around Auckland. But the Middle East is not a football match. It is a massive human bloody tragedy. And I don't think we can apply those rules in a place like the Middle East. Yes, I think we should be objective and unbiased on the side of those who suffer. If we were reporting slave trade in the 18th century, would we give equal time to the slave ship captain? No, we talked to the slaves and the survivors on that ship. If we were present at the liberation of a Nazi extermination camp, would we give equal time to the SS spokesman? No, I think not. We would interview the survivors and talk about the victims. Just as when I was in Jerusalem, I did not give equal time to Islamic Jihad spokesmen after seeing the savagery that suicide bombing committed. When I was in the Sabra and Shatila camps of 1982 and climbing over Palestinian bodies, I did not give equal time to the Israeli army who sent the Lebanese militia allies into the camps. Yes, I think we must be unbiased on the side of those who suffer and on the side of the victims. That is our job. It is not our job to treat the Middle East in the New York Times as a football match.
That's very
But yeah. So you see why we use that a lot as a resource over time, particularly and applied it to the Pacific. So one of the we had a considerable internships program, and so had students going off to a number of countries, mainly Fiji and Vanuatu and the Cook Islands, but we also had them going to Beijing, Jakarta, and also to Manila to work with media there. And this year, I just wanted to just show you this because when Shalene was talking about the elections coverage and so on, this is one of our students, Alistair Carter. She now works for the investigative consumer affairs investigative program, Fair Go, and Television New Zealand. But she was working for Radio Pasifik, where we had a partnership. Rather, it was our South Pacific program called the Southern Cross, and it was actually at Auckland University. So a great collaboration there, because we had our own radio station at AUT only had broadcast capability of about 1 kilometre, so it had no real audience. And so at Auckland University, where they had a real 95 BFM, a lot of top broadcasting people, sort of learned about broadcasting there. And it's mostly volunteers, but we actually had a weekly program run there. So, and Alistair also, she covered the Fiji elections in partnership with USP. She went over there, we had a two-person team joining Shailendra's team. And also we had Sri Krishnamurthy. He covered the 2018 coup along with the Fiji team at Wansolwara. Sadly, he's no longer with us today. But this is an example of the sort of collaborations that were going on. Now, I'm just going to wrap up very, very quickly, but I have to show you this. Another project we had was Bearing Witness, which was focused on climate change. And that we sent teams of 2 every year, mostly over to Fiji, and they were given assignment projects to work on around climate change. And I'll just show you this one here, which was a project, the last one that we did before the PMC closed, Barnabas of Rumby, A Story of Survival. And the thing about this is that the students who did this, because the mainstream media, correct me if I'm wrong about this, Shailendra, but Rumby is so far away from Suva, and there are so many remote islands in the Fiji Islands that they never get really any kind of media interest or coverage and so on, because the mainstream media don't have really the sources to send these students to these remote places. And in this case, we were lucky because the reporter, or there were 2 reporters involved, Heli Ikamoto, who's actually from New Zealand, and he grew up in New Zealand, but his mother was originally from Rumby, yes. And so just show you this now. Second, then I'll be wrapping up. Very short. This is just a trailer. It's not the actual documentary, which was featured in a number of film festivals.
During World War II, my ancestors were forcibly displaced from their island, Papua, and the Barbers had to move to Fiji Island of Red.
And the beach, most of the beach was here, behind the seawall. But now most of the beach is there and the houses are gone.
So as I say, that was the trailer. And if you want to see the actual documentary, you can see it on YouTube. And I'm just wrapping up now, but I want to acknowledge the Junction. JERAA's a tremendous collaborative website for all the journalism schools, because they've rescued the Pacific archives. I won't get the story there, you can read about it on the Junction. But thank you so much. And I'd like to thank Kate and Andrew and her colleagues for enabling this to happen. The rest is just resources. And thank you very much for bearing with me, and that I've been over time. So.
5 minutes. Why don't you come and sit, David? I mean, who has questions? Yeah, because I think there's probably a couple that will try to raise through. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, it was so interesting. Actually, I'm glad we had to go in depth. And but anyway, yes, go.
Thanks, Amanda Watson. My question is for Shailendra Singh. I would be very keen to know what has happened, in your view, regarding the Fiji media since the repeal of the Fiji Media Industry Development Act in April this year.
Very quickly, there was a lot of euphoria after the repeal of the Media Act, and I think I wrote an article saying, let's hold our horses because the government has yet to be tested. I mean, they say all the right things, that repeal the Media Act, but there are some warning signs. I think the Media Council has been reconstituted after such a long time. But there was a report in the Fiji Broadcasting Corporation about the Fiji government appealing the non-conviction of Wansolwara, the former Prime Minister, and the police commissioner for abuse of office. They were cleared by the court. A news media reported that the decision would be repealed by government. Immediately, the Attorney General kicked up a big complaint, and he said we would take the Fiji Broadcasting Commission to the Media Council. So they reconstituted the Media Council, and they were going to be the ones to lodge the first complaint. However, 2 days later, it was verified that yes, indeed, the Attorney General's office is going to appeal the decision. And there's just one warning sign. So yeah, the jury, see, you can have the nicest Media Act, they are working on a replacement Media Act, but are you willing to honor what is there in writing or not? It's the attitude of the government that matters, right? You can have the most beautifully crafted Media Act and all the media freedoms. If the government's intention is to not uphold those, then the media industry is still facing problems. So I'm not very optimistic as of now. Let's see what happens in the future.
Another question? Yeah.
I think during the space coup, when the website was closed down by USB, it was mirrored at the UTS under Wendy Bacon.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, and it's in my notes there. And sorry, I skipped through those last few slides very, very quickly and missed that. And that was really thanks to ACIJ and UTS.
And Wendy has a question as well.
Yeah, I've got a question. Actually, I think I'd just like to mention there that Peter Cronin, I've had a pretty big role in some of that as well. He's now got his own with Anthony Lowenstein, Declassified Australia, which shows him going on, I think, kind of new. David and Shailendra, I mean, like watching that last part, I'm struck by the fact that the centre in Auckland, that we all, some of the people here attended the World Conf, we were there, we saw the fantastic work you were doing, and Del was there too. I'd just like to ask you to both briefly say why you think, what are the key reasons why it's not there anymore? Because I think it's a bit of a tragedy for journalism education in our region. I mean, we could talk about the ACIJ too, but we won't. I think there is a focus on the Pacific. Yeah.
Just very briefly, there was a few complexities to it all, but I think very briefly, we had enormous support from AET when the PMC was founded. 3 years before it closed down and I retired, we had changes in management. There's a neoliberal, there's a whole middle management that's happened at so many universities. I won't bore you with all that, but two key people, the dean and the head of school, they made lip service to how important the PMC was. And it was quite apparent that they had their own agendas. And they kept saying that the centre would continue. But as soon as I left, basically the whole thing was wrapped up. And the two people that were very involved and had put in a bid to be co-directors for at least for 6 months or so while they recruited someone. And they kept being told, oh, yes, we'll sort it out. And sort of nothing ever happened and everything got shut down in the end. I think it's a lot of jealousy. I mean, well, there are two factors, I think. There's a lot of personal agendas and jealousies in the faculty as a result of what we're doing, because I think we have quite a lot of international exposure, and some people didn't like that. But the other thing I think is, and I can't prove it, but I'm going to say it here in this environment, in this room, is West Papua. We had a lot of pressure from the West Papuan, from the Indonesian government and the Indonesian embassy. And at one stage I was approached by the Indonesian embassy of the ambassador at the time, and he wanted to fund the centre. And I remember I made an excuse at the time. It's after I'd had an accident and I was, I was on crutches and things like that. It was a pretty weak excuse, of course, but he wanted to meet me about this. I had met him and had discussions prior to that. But it was quite obvious. They were very concerned about the PMC and its role at AUT, because we also were the only university that had an Indonesian centre, and the Indonesian government was involved in funding that. And at the same time as the PMC was closed, mysteriously the Indonesian centre also closed. So, and I was alerted by the director of international cooperation at the university, saying that the ambassador had been asking the university itself to, can't you pull the PMC's head in us? Yeah. So, but I'd like to follow that a bit more. So I'm just speculating about that, but I think I'm pretty sure that was a factor. And the university probably decided, well, you know, it was a good time now. It's an embarrassment. It's too politically involved, perhaps, something like that. Okay,
I think that's, you had a question? No. Okay, I was just waiting. Oh, right, okay. Yeah, it was super interesting. Yeah, plus it's really interesting. I think so many lessons for, you know, how to prepare journalism students for journalism today. So really, you know, thinking about what are the real challenges and how do you report for communities in ways that are valuable, you know, where you bring real value, because I mean, not only is it necessary in the world that we live in, but it's also a real challenge around sustainability. That if we want to have journalism, you know, that people will pay for, or that, you know, advertisers will see the community's value and will advertise, and then you have to actually deliver that journalism and value. And I think that the lens that you bring, the lens of inclusion and of, you know, grassroots focus, has lessons for all of us. And, you know, I was previously in the local journalism session, and I think there's so much to learn from what, you know, you've all talked about this afternoon in those arenas. So thank you very much. And now we'll have to a break and then dinner.
Actually, Jackie, one observation, I think, just the work you were talking about, Shailendra, about development journalism and then Talanoa journalism. I mean, I'm very interested in, and we're developing some training at the Foundation on Solutions Journalism Training. And I met Natasha Van Antwerpen, who's one of the registrants here, who's published an industry-focused course on constructive journalism. And so the more I'm learning about these approaches to, you know, covering social issues and challenges, and having worked in development journalism space myself for a long time, I see the real, I suppose what I'm saying is, I think as we're starting to think about inclusivity and removing prejudice from our practice, there's actually a huge value in consulting with Pacific journalists and educators, because that approach to storytelling has actually been baked into development journalism and Talanoa journalism for a really long time. I just think that solutions is a Pākehā way of describing a thing, you know. So it's an interesting value. I haven't kind of articulated, but I think there's a value that we haven't explored yet.
Yeah, I was thinking the same along similar lines to that, Corinne.
And I've actually been pondering the fact that when we teach journalism, many of us still use Stephen Landell's classic textbook. And it teaches a set of news values that he attributes to Masterton 1992. And I actually rummaged and found Masterton 1992 because it's like my whole journalism education career, I've been citing this thing and everybody read the paper. It was in a hard copy AJR. And it lists these things like conflict, proximity, and it leads to this watchdog journalism that you're talking to. And then I read David's Talanoa paper recently and was like, maybe we need to revisit Masterton 1992. I'm pondering redoing that. I think it's sort of due. And
it was only agreed, Kate.
And can I just chip in here in a possibly annoying fashion? First of all, Harcup and O'Neill have extensively revisited news values again and again. And also Helen Cable and Monica Bednarik have also taken a discourse approach. But what I wanted to say was that this work came out of White and also Galton and Rouge a very long time ago. And it started out as an observational study. It wasn't dictatorial. It wasn't saying, these are news values, you must use them. It was observing the practice of the editors choosing and selecting stories. So it's got a very interesting history. But what's interesting is it ends up in a textbook that's applied in the classroom. You, as journalism students, you need to know that these are the news values, capital N, capital V. So it's certainly a conversation that's worth having.
Yeah, I just I'm rambling on that. And John wrote a little thing that talked about Harcup, O'Neill and the Gal and those names that you used.
Galton and Rouge.
Galton and Rouge, that was it. But I'm interested, do you think that those values would benefit the Western global North media? Do you to bring those Talanoa ideas?
See, what we have, the problem we have is economically sustainable model. The models we have in India are the commercially advertising model, the government funded public service model. There are restrictions. And now when we are looking at media working with communities together, there was something called public journalism some time ago in the West. You should ask the question why it didn't work. I think it's the economic model. Then there's the community radio models also. Some studies in Asia aiming on this. The problem is the economic viability of it. How to make it economically viable. So now in the next few days in China, we'll be discussing this model because that particular University of Media Development. And we are looking at a model now. I used to have Chinese students in my classes in Singapore and Bangkok. And they used to do some interesting submissions using Weibo and social media. Now, so when we read this, it's not true that there's no media freedom in China. Only issue is you don't attack the country in Beijing, but at local level.
That's not my experience, I have to say. That's not my experience of knowing quite a few journalists in China and having been involved in the China journalism project over many years, run out of Hong Kong. It's just not my experience that it's not, there's press reading. There is of course there is some, but it's declined massively. And the thing is, you never know where the line is, like what you were talking about in Fiji, under the old legislation, that you kind of you can push and push, and then suddenly you're over the line and you'll disappear, or but certainly not an environment. So I just have to say, I would not agree with that.
Even I was working in Singapore. It's a similar model. Singapore has been a similar model to China, the government model. And there are certain ways you
It's not similar to Singapore. I just disagree. It's not. Singapore is a model, definitely, that curtails freedom, but nothing like what happens in China.
It's how you interpret it. Because now, 2 days ago, I was reading about the Chinese government. They have now said you can't go on Weibo and these influencers who are called influencers. They have to name who are called influencers, who have millions of followers. And now they have to give their own name and their practices. Now, when I was reading that, I was wondering, what is this to say there's freedom? Of course, those influencers are not political influencers in a way, but they influence social values and many other values in China. They have millions of followers and they're now protesting that they can't go anonymous. Okay, so that's an interesting issue.
And I didn't mean to hijack, because actually I think it's really interesting what we were talking about, which was that sort of model of, where the model that you have both, talked about, whether that's applicable to media in Australia or Western media, indeed. And like I would say from my experience in research, it definitely is, because I think the only media that is of value now is one that clearly understands the job that it's doing for its audiences or for its community. And that's really, it's from that the the principles of journalism, I think, that should be guiding journalism today come. I mean, obviously it has to be sustainable as well, but I think it's really, it has to be journalism-led, strong mission, and but also one that very much centres the community.
I think so. What I was saying is journalism should be anchored to the national context. Fiji's national context is vastly different from Australia or New Zealand, and there's no one-size-fits approach. You adapt to your own conditions. That would be my understanding.
And I would say that my experience most has been journalism, and just talk about in this presentation here, that's far more in common with Indigenous media in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and also Indigenous media here. And there certainly is a lot to be shared, and I think there's certainly a debate going on in New Zealand now. It was under the previous government. Now we're very worried about the rollback. Increasingly, there was more space being given Indigenous media. In New Zealand, for example, we've got a whole network of EV radio stations, essentially community stations and so on. And we've got Mile Television, 2 channels, one in JERAA completely, and one in English, which is aiming at a broader audience. All these sort of developments are really tremendous. But I would say that there's a lot of common ground between what we've been doing for a long time and those voices. And increasingly, I think it's actually having an impact on mainstream media, and you see changes actually happening in the mainstream as a result. I mean, for example, the Stuff Network, which is a major website in New Zealand, made a public apology for its racist journalism over years, over many decades and so on, and made a public admission that our coverage has been wrong, sort of thing, and they've made a real effort now to try and change it. I mean, nothing changes overnight, but there's that debate, there is that conversation going on.
It also becomes an economic imperative, because, and I've seen this in a lot of local media in the US, in that because you have to actually build your audience, right? Because the sort of revenue streams are changing, a lot of it's revenue generated. So you actually have to start to think about who is my audience and how do I reach people that traditionally weren't reached by these printed papers. And it changes the journalism as well, because you start to think about things like crime, like how do I report on crime? Is it reporting on, say, Black communities, or is it reporting more from a policing perspective, like how it's been,
Look, I very much agree with what you're saying, and I also agree with what Kalinda said about the market. If you don't have, if it doesn't fit within our commercial Western model of media, or the ABC, which has a very, very middle class perspective, I would say 2/3 of Sydney is not covered by any local media at all anymore. I've done a tiny bit of local reporting on environmental landfill type issues for a very, very small audience, simply to give them some sort of voice on one very tiny issue. But really, because of the collapse of local journalism, it was never very strong. Let's face it, was always advertising fed with real estate. And, I just wonder I do really think that that is leading to more disenchantment, more lack of trust. I mean, if the media doesn't tell your stories, why should you trust it? Why should you, if it's only telling stories about how much the last house sold for in Sydney, then why should you have any interest or sympathy with it? And if someone else is telling you something else, well, why not believe that? So I think it's a huge problem. And it all goes back to inequality and, you know, market economics and journalism. And it's sort of a pity, I think, here that there's not a stronger journalism school in Western Sydney at the University of Western Sydney. And I don't know why that is, but that, looking at the initiatives that David and I'm sure you two have too, but David's taken over the years, which was working. It really, I mean, I went to Port Moresby in the mid-90s, and I was quite shocked because there were sort of protests at the airport and World Bank riots, and here were these students who'd only arrived at the journalism school pumping out a newspaper like every day. It was quite incredible. So I think amazing things can be done in journalism schools, but yeah, obviously it's not a total answer to the model. Well then, you can't really, there's just not the resources to get it going. Anyway, enough for me on that, but I do think it's questioning of what media is for.
Yeah, that's an interesting thing.
It's important to remember what.
There's an interesting project going on at the USP now. It's I've been talking with Charlene about it for the last few weeks. It's called COCA project. COCA project is it's not our school, environmental school. One of our former colleagues is working on including digital publication. There are two researchers, both Fijians. They have been going around the Pacific, talking to grassroots communities about planting in general.
Actually, there's so cool.
And they'll be putting together a report from the Pacific perspective, because there's a report in the which comes into local meeting, IPCC or something. And there's two people who are on the Pacific in New Zealand and Australia. And now this is going to be the Pacific perspective. Usually we'll put together, but now I've been talking to the person doing it. He says it's a very serious communication problem in the remote community. They don't have radio, they don't have newspaper, they don't have any media, but they have so now we have been talking about people who are a model broadcasting sort of to create how give them information and also to be processed. But now, after looking at the community radio